Hello, everyone, and thank you again for joining into this session of the OpenStack training. This session will be focusing around the deep dive of the OpenStack, and hopefully, you recall from the past two sessions. We went through the introduction of the OpenStack, we discussed all those components, and as I promised in the last session, we will be doing a deep dive into every project. So we are starting our first project or the first component of the OpenStack, which is Keystone. So the Keystone, if you recall, is our identity project. So we will be doing a deeper dive today into the Keystone project. We will be going through the overview of Keystone, followed by an architecture, the workflow, and then some of the configuration. So let's understand what is Keystone or go through a basic overview of Keystone. So the Keystone is the central authentication and authorization engine in OpenStack, which is responsible for your authentication and the authorization piece. It provides authentication not only to the users, but as well as the other OpenStack services. So if one service wants to talk to the another service, let's say that Nova wants to talk to the Glance project or to the Glance service, that request will be again needs to be authenticated by the Keystone. So the Keystone is a central piece where every service talks to the Keystone. Keystone provides your identity service, your token, catalog, and policy service. Keystone uses your identity version, API version 2 or 3. You will see when we would be doing the lab, we would be referencing either version 2 or version 3. Usually in a typical deployment, Keystone is the first service that needs to be installed. And the reason behind that, as you understand, as we mentioned on the second bullet point, it's not just the user needs to be authenticated, it's all about rest of the other OpenStack services too. So we want to make sure before we start installing our other services, we have the Keystone infrastructure up and ready and is available for any kind of authentication. Let's learn some of the basic concepts around the Keystone to get a better understanding while we go through this rest of the presentation, as well as when we go into the deeper our hands-on lab. So I'm sure most of you are already familiar what is a user. So user is nothing but is a digital representation of a person, system, or services who uses OpenStack service. And usually they have an associated information such as username and password. Username and password are nothing but known as the credentials. Sometime you may find an email address too. Tenants or projects is a container simply to group or isolate your resources. You must specify a tenant to make requests to any of your OpenStack service. A tenant could be simply a particular customer, it could be an account, or it could represent a whole organization. You can assign directly users to a particular tenant so they can manage that particular tenant or project. Role, as usual, includes a set of rights and privileges that tells what operations a particular user is permitted to perform in a given tenant they are part of. Token. That is something we need to understand and we need to be very clear about the Keystone. The token is very important. So the token is an arbitrary bit of text that is used to access resources. Each token has a scope, which basically describes which resources are accessible with it. We will be looking into more details on the token, but just keeping these two things in mind that the token is a bit of text and the token tells us or it defines a scope that what resources are available when you use a particular token. Endpoints. It's a network accessible address, usually described by a URL. So when I say URL, it's something like an web URL that you type like http:// hostname or IP address, and then you would go ahead and specify a particular port that would translates back to one of your OpenStack services. So the endpoint is a network accessible address, usually described by URL, from where you access an OpenStack service. So we are talking about the Nova as the service, Swift, Glance, and so on. By default, this URL is available for all of our projects or all of our OpenStack services. Services, we have been talking in the past two presentations, our core services, our shared services. So the services provides one or more endpoints through which the users can access resources and perform operations. So again, an example, Nova being one of the services, Glance, Swift, Neutron, and many more. Each service, there are a few unique things that we need to remember about services. That each service is identified by an identification number. There is a name for every service. There is a type for that service, and there is a description for that service. And while doing the lab, I will show you all these things that we would get to see. There is an identification number, there is a name for your service, there is a type for your service, and optionally there is a description. And usually these services are associated with your endpoints. So we just discussed the endpoint or the URL. So you associate those URLs and you tie to your service, and that's how you can access your services using endpoint or using the URL. Usually these endpoints, the URL, there are like three types of URL that you would go ahead and configure. A public URL, which is accessible, that you want to make available to everyone outside of your organization, so people can really make use of that. So that's your public URL. You will have an internal URL, which is primarily meant when one service wants to talk to the another service, they would be using this internal URL. Admin URL, it's for your admin portal. Using this URL, you would be managing your OpenStack infrastructure. And then there is a service catalog, is a service list plus endpoint. So the catalog list, okay, these are my services and these are my endpoints that are available in this catalog. Let's understand a few more basic things about the OpenStack Keystone and how some of the things works. So when an incoming function call arises, Keystone confirms if it from an authorized user via credential. So what basically is Keystone is doing is authenticating, or we are authenticating against Keystone using the credentials, which are like username, password, and a particular URL. Once an identity is confirmed, so once the Keystone sees, okay, hey, this user is a valid user, it provides a token. And if you recall, the token is nothing, it's an arbitrary bit of text. Tokens are a string of ASCII characters that represents a successful authentication request. So once a user is confirmed or authenticated, they will be presented with a token. Now, the token includes the list of the user projects and the roles in them. So basically, we are defining a scope. The user can now submit token instead of re-authenticating on every request. So now, instead of supplying the username and password over and over again to different services, now every time when I want to request some service or when I'm talking to my endpoint, instead of supplying my username and password, I can just simply supply the token that I received from the Keystone. So that would save a lot of my time instead of typing username and password again and again. The good thing, the token, there is a lifetime for the token, there is an expiration time, there is a validity, which is a good thing is a configuration. It used to be defaulted 24 hours in the previous releases of the OpenStack, but with the Icehouse, the default timer was changed to 1 hour. A Keystone uses the Python-based library and daemons to receive service and admin API requests. One important thing to note about the authentication or the Keystone project, We've been talking the Keystone is responsible for authentication and authorization. So the, because of that, the Keystone architecture is so flexible that it provides a pluggable backend architecture, which helps Keystone to integrate with different environments. So you can integrate with your LDAP. You can use SQL as a backend, like you can use SQLite or you can use MySQL. You can connect to your existing Active Directory, or you can connect to your Open LDAP or Red Hat LDAP or some other LDAP services. So for these, we got a different backend architectures. Keystone also tracks what open services are installed and where to locate them on the network. So usually Keystone stores all of these information into a database. And for this presentation or for this training, we will be using MySQL. If you look the official OpenStack documentation also, uh, MySQL is the something is standard and being used throughout for a lot of services. So we will be sticking to the same one and we will be using MySQL. Now let's do a little deeper dive into the architecture. I would take a moment of pause and I'll let you read through this whole slide and look through different component on this slide, and then we'll walk through and see what are the different services available to us. So OpenStack services are talking to the Keystone API. On the back end, we got different backends. The Keystone API is talking to all of these different backends. Like we got a token backend, which simply contains all your temporary tokens that are issued. Your catalog backend contains your endpoint registry. Your identity backend contains your users and groups information. Your credential backend contains your credentials, like you can talk to the EC2 tokens or you can use Amazon Web Services. Assignment backend contains your domains, projects, roles, and role assignments. If you talk about the policy backend, it's a rule management interface and rule-based authorization. So as you can see, the OpenStack or the Keystone API got different backends it's talking to, and every backend is responsible or is doing a different job over here. Hopefully you got a better picture. The OpenStack is talking to the Keystone API and the Keystone API is talking to all of these backends into the background. Let's understand the Keystone workflow basically, like as we said. So when first time a user comes, user is authenticating using the credentials, which are username, password to the Keystone. And if that user is valid, and if that user is valid, Keystone returns a token, which is again a ASCII text of character or a text. Now we are assuming that the user was successfully authenticated and we got a valid token. Now let's say that user wants to spawn a new VM. So now the user will be sending this token plus a request for a new VM to the Nova project or to the Nova component or to the Nova service. Now Nova is going to take that token and verify from the Keystone, making sure that this user who is requesting a VM is, is allowed or has a scope to create a new VM. We are verifying against the Keystone. Keystone says, hey, okay, this user is allowed to create a VM. Nova says, okay, that's fine. Let's go ahead and proceed next. Now we are using the same token and we are requesting an image from the Glance project. So we can spawn a VM. Now Glance will say, hold on, let me verify. Using this token, are you able to talk to me or not? So Glance again goes back to the Keystone and verifies that this user is allowed or is there is a scope using which it's allowed to talk to the Glance project. If everything works fine for this user, Glance will go ahead and serve that image back to the node. Now, the Nova will again take that token and will go back to our quantum or our neutron project and requesting a VIF so we can have a virtual NIC provision for this. Same thing, your neutron service or your quantum service will go back again to the Keystone, will verify that using this token, this user is allowed to provision a new VIF. If everything is okay, Neuron project will go ahead and assign a VIF. And if the response is successful, you would see that we are getting a successful response and the user is getting a successful response back. So now you can see that how this token is useful. Instead of supplying the username and password or the credentials over and over again, we are just passing the same token over and over again. And if you notice one more thing, every time when we are making a request between these different services, the service is also verifying that token against the keystone, making sure that this user is allowed or has a rights or has a scope to do all these different actions. Keystone Lab. Just remember a few things that the configuration for the keystone is handled using simple text, which are the INI files. We will be doing a detailed lab covering the keystone in the next session. We will not be doing any lab today. We will be doing a lab later in the next session, which will cover the keystone that we just discussed into greater details. Hopefully, by this time, you have a better understanding of the keystone, a keystone architecture, different terminologies involved or work around the keystone workflow, how the token is used, and how everything works. Thank you again for joining into this session of training. I will see you in the next session. Thank you. Bye-bye.